I want to tell you something before I get into any of it. There's a moment, and I've heard this from other people too, people who have been in rooms where the air changes before anything happens. There's a moment right before things go sideways where everything gets very, very quiet inside your own head. Not outside. Outside it can be loud. Outside people can be yelling and radios can be crackling and wind can be cutting through concrete canyons like a blade. But inside the skull, behind the eyes it gets library quiet. Like your brain just decides this is too important for noise. I've been told that's training. I've been told that's what thousands of hours of repetition does to the nervous system. It strips out the panic and leaves only the calculation. Maybe. Or maybe some people are just built different from the start, and the training just figures out which ones those are. Her name was Mara Voss. Not that anyone was calling her that on the morning I'm talking about. On that morning she was operator 2, or sometimes just 2, or sometimes just a voice in a headset that other voices were starting to ignore because the situation had gone sideways in a way that nobody planned for, and the men in charge were doing what men in certain situations sometimes do. They were reverting. They were reverting to the old logic, the one that says, when it gets bad, you go with what you know. And what they knew, in that deep, muscle memory part of their training, didn't include her. It didn't include a woman with a rifle on a rooftop. Not that morning. Not until she proved them wrong with a single pull of a trigger that I will never forget for as long as I live. I wasn't supposed to be there. Let me be upfront about that. I'm a journalist, or I was back then. I'm other things now, retired mostly, but in the summer of 2018 I was still working, still carrying a press credential in my jacket pocket, still showing up to places where things were about to happen because that was the job. Find the thing before it happens. Get close enough to document it. Then get out without becoming part of the story. That last part I didn't always manage. I had a source, I won't name the source, even now, who had told me 3 days earlier that something was being planned. Not a full briefing, not details. Just the shape of it, the rough geography of a threat, the kind of whisper that sends your nerves humming at a frequency you can't quite turn off. I'd followed that whisper to a press access area roughly 400 meters from a location I'm still not going to identify by its full name in this document. I'll call it the compound, because that's what it looked like from where I was standing. Walls, fencing, guards in positions I didn't fully understand until later. The day was cold for the season. That surprised me. I'd expected summer warmth, the kind of lazy heat that softens the edges of cities and makes tourists forget to pay attention to what's around them. Instead, there was a sharpness in the air, a northeast wind that had come from somewhere with teeth, and the people around me, the tourists, the press, the low-level security personnel managing crowd flow. Everyone had their collars up and their hands jammed into pockets and their eyes watering slightly from the wind. It made everyone look suspicious, actually. Red eyes, hunched shoulders, faces turned slightly away from the direction they were moving. The wind was doing more to disguise intent than any tradecraft I'd ever observed. I set up at my position around 6:45 in the morning. Press access opened at 7. I had a long lens on my camera, a notebook in my coat pocket that I hadn't opened yet, and a thermos of terrible coffee from a machine in a petrol station that I'd hit at 5:30 a.m. because I'd made the mistake of telling myself I'd sleep, and then, predictably, hadn't slept at all. I was tired. The details of a tired person at a press position probably seem irrelevant. They're not, because the story I'm telling you is about the difference between what gets seen and what gets missed, and the first thing that determines what you see is how awake you are when you're looking. I was awake enough. Barely, but enough. She was in position before I got there. I found this out later, from someone I'll describe only as a person with knowledge of the operational timeline. She'd been on that rooftop since approximately 0400, which meant she'd been lying in a specific and uncomfortable posture on a graveled surface, in near-freezing pre-dawn wind for close to 3 hours, by the time the crowd began to assemble below. 3 hours. I want you to think about what 3 hours on a rooftop feels like. Not moving, not allowing yourself to shift your weight in any way that might disturb the loose stones beneath you. Breathing in a controlled, shallow pattern so that the rise and fall of your chest doesn't alter your sight picture even fractionally. Staying warm enough to function while wearing a profile that didn't allow for the kind of bulk that warmth usually requires. 3 hours of that. And then on top of the physical discomfort, 3 hours of mental maintenance. Because the mind doesn't just wait quietly on its own. You have to manage it. You have to keep running checks, sight lines, wind readings, communication status, the state of the equipment under your hands, while simultaneously preventing the kind of drift that 3 hours of stillness invites. The drift toward doubt, toward second-guessing, toward the part of the human brain that has never evolved past the point of asking, what are we doing here, really? Is this actually going to matter? She was 29 years old. Her file, and I've seen parts of her file years later, through channels I won't describe, her file described her as exceptional in static patience operations, which is official language for she could lie still longer than almost anyone else they'd ever tested, not just in terms of physical endurance, in terms of mental architecture. She could maintain full operational focus across extended static periods in a way that most people simply could not. It also noted, in language that was more neutral than it deserved to be, that she had been subject to persistent institutional resistance regarding forward deployment eligibility, which meant they'd been trying to keep her off the rooftop. For 2 years, they'd been trying to keep her off the rooftop. She grew up in a place called Millhaven, Minnesota. It's not a famous place. It's not a place that appears in many stories. It's the kind of small city that exists in American life in a way that most people from coastal areas don't fully understand. Not poor, not wealthy, not depressed and not thriving. Just a place where people live and work, and where the winters are long and the summers are short, and where the landscape is flat enough that the sky feels very close and very large in a way that either comforts you or makes you feel exposed, depending on who you are. She felt comforted by it. This is significant, because most of what she'd go on to do in her professional life involved controlled exposure, the willingness to put yourself in a position where there's nothing between you and whatever's coming. And that comfort with openness, that early childhood experience of standing in a flat place under a big sky and feeling okay about it. She credited that later, in a conversation that was recorded in circumstances I won't detail, for her ability to hold a rooftop position without losing herself to the anxiety of exposure. She was the younger of 2 children. Her brother, Thomas, was 4 years older. Her father worked for a utilities company for 31 years. Her mother taught middle school mathematics and later, after the kids were grown, became a competitive archer. Which is something I only mention because of how often it gets mentioned by the people who knew Mara, the archery. The precision, the patience, the willingness to hold tension longer than felt comfortable, and then longer than that, and then release at exactly the right moment. Thomas would later tell an interviewer that Mara could outshoot him at a rifle range by the time she was 14. Not better with practice, not close, outshoot. Like there was something in the mechanics of it that her body had already understood before her mind had finished learning. She did well in school without it defining her. She ran track distance events, not sprints. She was good at languages, good enough to add Dari and Russian to Spanish and French before she was 22. She had close friends but was, by their accounts, quietly self-contained in a way that wasn't unfriendly but was clearly present. She was the person in the group who listened more than she spoke, and who, when she did speak, tended to say something that made everyone else's previous statements feel slightly less thought through. She applied to the Navy when she was 21. She applied specifically because of the physical challenge, she said in her entrance interview, but also, And this part she said slowly, like she was testing the words before she committed to them. Also because she wanted to be somewhere that actual stakes existed. Somewhere that the thing you were doing mattered in a way that wasn't metaphorical. The recruiter, according to documents I've read, noted in the margin, motivation, genuine, recommend for advanced track. The SEAL selection process is brutal in ways that have been written about extensively, and in ways that haven't. The ways that have been written about are the physical ones. The cold water, the sleep deprivation, the log PT and the mud and the relentless compounding fatigue. Those things are real and they're as bad as described and possibly worse, because no description fully captures the texture of 17 days without meaningful sleep, inside a body that has been cold for so long that the cold has become your normal temperature and warmth, when it briefly appears, feels like a hallucination. She went through all of that. What hasn't been written about as much, because it's harder to document, and because the people it happens to tend not to talk about it in public forums, is the social dimension of selection for women. The small frictions, the ambient skepticism, the way that the testing gets applied differently, not in the official criteria but in the thousand small unofficial ways that an institution communicates its expectations. The extra watching. The extra need to prove not just that you can do what's required, but that you belong in the category of people who are supposed to do what's required. She passed everything they gave her. She passed it at times in scores that were, in several categories, among the highest recorded for her cohort regardless of gender. She was first in her class in marksmanship across 3 separate evaluation periods. Her psychological evaluations described her as characterized by unusual integration of analytical function and operational nerve, which is a clinical way of saying that she could think clearly and act cleanly at the same time, which is actually the rarest thing there is. When she was cleared for advanced sniper qualification, the pathway that would eventually put her on that rooftop, there were, according to people who were present, expressions of institutional discomfort at levels above her direct supervisors. Not loud objections. Nothing that left a paper trail that made anyone look bad. Just the quiet friction of a system that hadn't figured out yet how to update its mental model. She didn't respond to any of it. Not publicly. Not in the ways that would have been noticed and filed somewhere. She responded by continuing to perform at a level that made it increasingly difficult for the institutional discomfort to find anything legitimate to attach itself to. That's a particular kind of discipline, possibly the hardest kind. I want to be honest with you about something. When I was standing in that press area on the morning in question, I didn't know any of this yet. I didn't know her name. I didn't know she was on the rooftop to my left. I didn't know that a conversation was happening in the command element at that moment. A conversation that I would piece together later from multiple sources and that I'll describe to you now, not because I was there for it, but because the people who have been, over the years, willing to give me enough detail that I believe I have it right. The conversation was happening in a mobile command unit approximately 230 meters from my position. There were 5 people in that unit. The senior officer present, I'll call him Commander P because his identity remains operationally sensitive, was a man in his late 50s who had 30 years of operational experience, and who was, by all accounts from people who worked with him, an excellent officer in most respects. In most respects, the situation had developed in a way that the previous 12 hours of planning had not fully anticipated. A threat element that was supposed to be constrained to one vector had, in the preceding 90 minutes, shifted position in a way that changed the geometry of the response. The angle of cover that the existing sniper positions provided had been partially compromised. Not fully, not catastrophically, but enough that there was now a gap, a sightline gap, a coverage gap that needed to be filled. There was one position in the whole operational geometry that covered that gap. The rooftop, where Mara Voss had been lying in the cold for 3 hours. The conversation that happened in that command unit, as it's been described to me, went approximately like this. Commander P looked at the tactical map for approximately 45 seconds. Then he said, "Who do we have in position 7? His intelligence officer, I'll call her Lieutenant D, said, "Operator 2, sir. Voss." There was a silence. "Voss." "Yes, sir." Another silence, longer. "What's her status?" "She's been in position since 0400. Full communication and sight picture confirmed." He looked at the map again. Someone else in the unit, one of the tactical coordinators, said something quietly that Lieutenant D later described to a colleague as unhelpful, and which that colleague paraphrased to me as a suggestion that position 7 should be deprioritized and the coverage gap accepted as manageable. Commander P didn't respond to that suggestion immediately. He kept looking at the map. You could tell from the description I've been given that he was doing math, not abstract math, operational math, the kind where the variables are lives. "The coverage gap," he said finally. "Walk me through it." Lieutenant D walked him through it. 3 minutes of precise tactical language that I'll spare you the verbatim detail of, but the summary was, the gap was real, it was significant, and position 7 was the only position that addressed it. Commander P sat back. He rubbed his face with both hands in the way that people rub their faces when they're trying to push through something they don't entirely want to face. "She's qualified," he said. "Top of her cohort in marksmanship, sir. 3 evaluation periods. She holds the fast target record in Category C for her class year." "I know what her file says." "Then you know she's qualified, sir." Another silence. "And then get her on the line." She heard the command channel click in a specific pattern, 2 shorts, 1 long, that she'd been told meant command direct communication incoming. She was already looking through her scope when the voice came through. "Operator 2. 2, go. Confirm your sight picture on the northeast approach." She gave him the confirmation. Range, angle, wind adjustment, sight clarity. Clinical. Precise. The voice of someone who has been doing this in their head for 3 hours already and for whom the request for confirmation is almost boring. Commander P, on the other end, said nothing for a moment. "Then we may need you to engage on command if the primary vector presents." There was a pause on her end. Not hesitation. Everyone I've talked to about this is very clear on the distinction. Not hesitation. Just the half-second acknowledgement of something significant. "Understood, sir. I'm ready." Another pause on his end. 2, I need to be direct with you about something. "Sir." "There are going to be people on this net who are going to want to pull you from that position. I can't promise that won't happen. What I can tell you is that your coverage is currently the most critical element in our geometry, and I need you to maintain it until I tell you otherwise. Can you do that?" She said, "I can do that, sir." She didn't ask why there were going to be people trying to pull her from the position. She already knew why. "I want to tell you about the crowd below, because the crowd is part of the story in a way that matters." By 8 a.m., there were somewhere between 300 and 400 people in the public areas around the location. Tourists mostly, families with small children in push strollers, older couples with good cameras, and the measured patience of people who have learned that the best shots come from waiting. A school group from somewhere, I heard German, possibly Dutch, that was moving in the contained chaos that school groups always generate. A handful of people like me, press or adjacent to press, with credentials and lenses and the professional habit of scanning faces. The atmosphere was festive in a cautious, early morning sort of way. People were drinking from thermoses and travel cups. A few had folding camp stools. There was a smell in the air of the street food carts that had set up at the permitted distance, fried things, sweet things, the particular scent of a thermos of coffee opened in cold air. And underneath all of that, underneath the ordinary pleasant atmosphere of a crowd that had gathered for a thing they expected to be ceremonial and scenic, there was something else, not visible, not something you could point to and say, that is the thing, but present, the way a change in barometric pressure is present before a storm. Something in the air that the crowd didn't know how to read, but that was affecting their behavior in small ways, people drifting slightly more towards certain areas, slightly away from others. An animal instinct operating below conscious awareness. I noticed it. I've been in enough places where things were about to happen to notice when the atmosphere is wrong in that particular way. I wrote 2 words in my notebook at 8:12 a.m. Something's off. And then I went back to watching. The name of the threat, I'll tell you only in general terms. What had been identified through intelligence channels that I don't have permission to detail was a high-probability threat actor, a single individual who had constructed a plan that, if executed, would have been catastrophic in its specific context. Not geopolitically catastrophic, not a war-starting event, but an act of targeted violence against a specific person or persons in a specific location that would have been devastating in its immediate human cost and enormously destabilizing in its ripple effects. The actor, I'll call him the target, using the operational language that was being used in the command element, had been tracked for 11 weeks. His pattern of movement had been mapped. His behavioral signatures had been cataloged. The intelligence picture suggested he would move on this morning. The intelligence picture also suggested, incorrectly as it turned out, that he would move from the south. He moved from the northeast. He moved from the northeast, which was the gap in the coverage geometry, which was the gap that only position 7, Mara's position, could see. I didn't know this in real time. What I knew in real time was that at approximately 8:27 a.m., 3 things happened in very quick succession that I registered as a journalist observing the scene, though I didn't fully understand their meaning until later. First, the 2 security personnel closest to me changed their posture, not dramatically, not in a way that the general crowd would have caught. But they went from a comfortable watchful stance, weight distributed, eyes moving in their established pattern, to something more deliberate, more forward-leaning. Their hands moved without my being able to say exactly where they moved to, but they moved. Second, I heard, through the general ambient noise of the crowd, a sound that I initially couldn't place. A voice, not the crowd voices, not the security voices, a voice that seemed to come from a specific direction. Low, rapid, the cadence of command communication. Third, the radio at my hip. I had a press monitoring frequency that was supposed to carry only public access traffic, produced a burst of static that was followed by approximately 2 seconds of what I can only describe as controlled urgency. Not panic, not yelling. The precise, clipped language of people who are doing something that requires their full attention, and no, they don't have time to waste a syllable. I turned my camera toward the northeast. The full story of what the target did in those next 4 minutes is something I've been able to reconstruct from multiple sources, including debrief materials that were shared with me under conditions I've promised to respect by not describing in full. I'll give you the shape of it. He had been in the crowd. He'd been there since well before 8. He'd arrived in the area during the early morning window when crowd management is at its lightest, when the shift change is happening, when the density of watchers is lowest, when the ambient disorder of a large group of people assembling provides the most cover. He was carrying something in a configuration that was designed to defeat casual observation. It had taken the intelligence personnel watching the crowd feeds 11 minutes to identify him, and even then, the identification had come with a confidence interval rather than a certainty, and the decision to treat it as actionable had been made by Commander P, based on an assessment of risk that I imagine kept him awake for a long time afterward. When the target moved, he moved quickly. He moved out of the crowd in the direction that created the maximum gap in the original coverage geometry, not by accident, by design. He had done his homework. He had understood the architecture of the response, and he had found the seam in it. The seam that led to the northeast approach. The seam that led directly into Mara's sight picture. In the command unit, what happened at 8:28 a.m. was a disagreement. I've described it to you as a disagreement because that's the polite term. People who were present have used other terms. The tactical coordinator who had earlier suggested deprioritizing position 7 now made what Lieutenant D later described as an emphatic recommendation. His words, her paraphrasing, that the rooftop engagement be delayed pending secondary confirmation from the primary sniper team. The primary sniper team did not have the angle. Commander P knew the primary sniper team did not have the angle. The tactical coordinator argued that an untested, his word, operator in the primary engagement role was an unacceptable risk. Lieutenant D said on record that she responded to this by pointing out calmly that Mara Voss was the top-rated marksmanship performer in her cohort, and that, untested in this specific operational context, was true of every operator before their first operational engagement, and did not constitute a meaningful objection. The tactical coordinator said, and this is a paraphrase of a paraphrase, but I believe it to be accurate in its essence, that the issue was not capability. The issue was reliability under novel pressure. Lieutenant D said, "Are you suggesting she's less reliable because of her gender?" The tactical coordinator did not answer that directly. Commander P, who had been silent for approximately 15 seconds while listening to this exchange, said, "That's enough." He picked up the communication unit. He said, "Operator 2." And then the tactical coordinator said, "Sir, I have to formally recommend that you pull Voss from the primary engagement role and..." Commander P said, "Drop it." And then into the communication unit he said, "Operator 2, confirm your target lock." Mara said, "Confirmed, sir. Target is in range. I have a clean sight picture. Wind is steady. I'm ready." And then the tactical coordinator said it. He said, and this is something that Lieutenant D has confirmed to me directly, in her own words, not a paraphrase, he said, "Drop the rifle. Pull her out. This is not what she's here for." Commander P looked at him for a moment. Then Commander P looked at the tactical map. Then Commander P looked at the communication unit in his hand. He made a decision. "Operator 2, he said, "you are authorized to engage on my mark." There was a single breath of silence. "Copy that, sir, on your mark. I'm going to tell you about the shot. Not technically, not in the language of ballistics and trigger weight and breath control, though all of those things were present and all of those things matter. I'm going to tell you what it felt like from where I was, 400 meters away, with my long lens pointed at the northeast approach, and my tired journalist's brain trying to process what it was watching. I had the target in frame by 8:29. I didn't know he was the target at that moment. What I saw was a man moving with a specific quality of purpose that distinguished him from the crowd around him. The way a current in a river is different from the water surrounding it. Same substance, different direction, different intention. He was moving quickly, 40, 50 meters from the nearest secondary fence line, far enough that the ground-level security response was still organizing, close enough that the window was real. I heard Commander P's voice in my earpiece. The press monitoring frequency had gone to a restricted channel by that point, but I had what I had say 2 words. "Mark, mark." And then, the sound. There's a specific acoustic quality to a high-velocity rifle shot that people who have been around them describe differently from people who haven't. I've been around them. I won't romanticize the sound or make it cinematic in ways that would feel dishonest. What I'll say is that it was sharp and flat and absolute in the way that a door slamming in an empty house is absolute. The sound arrives, and the silence after it is different from the silence before. The target stopped. He didn't fall immediately. That's the thing that surprises people who haven't seen it, the tiny delay between the instant and the consequence. A fraction of a second where he was still standing and moving, and then a fraction later where he was not. He went down. The crowd, the portion of the crowd that was in a position to register what had happened, produced a sound that I've never been able to adequately describe in print. Not a scream, not a shout, more like the collective intake of breath of 300 people at the same moment, a sound with mass to it, something you felt in your sternum. And then the organized chaos of a security response in motion. And then in my earpiece, something I was not supposed to hear. Commander P's voice. Quiet, specific, with the weight of someone saying something they mean exactly. He said, "Outstanding shot too, outstanding." She didn't move for another 47 minutes. I want you to understand that. She lay on that rooftop in the cold for another 47 minutes after the shot, until the all clear was confirmed and the situation was fully contained, and the possibility of a secondary threat had been exhausted. She didn't stand up and look out over the city. She didn't pump her fist or cry or do any of the things that movies tell us people do after a moment like that. She maintained her position. She maintained her sight picture. She kept doing the job. Because that's what the job was. The job didn't end with the shot. The shot was one moment in a job that had begun at 4 a.m. and didn't end until someone on the command frequency said, formally and officially, "All operators stand down. All clear confirmed." She stood up then. Or rather, she very carefully, very slowly, got herself off a graveled surface after nearly 4 hours of near-complete stillness, which, if you've never tried to move a body that has been that still for that long, is harder than it sounds. A member of her support team who was on the roof with her, maintaining the communications relay, staying out of her operational zone, told me later that when she finally stood and turned around, her expression was not what he expected. He'd expected relief. He'd expected some visible form of emotional release. What he saw was something quieter than that. She checked her weapon. She checked her equipment. She gave him a brief nod. She said, "What's the transit window back to primary?" He told her. She said, "Okay." And that was it. The tactical coordinator had already left the command unit by the time the after-action communication began. Commander P sent a single communication on the command frequency that was heard by everyone with access to that channel. It was brief. It was specific. It was the kind of thing that, in the context of that world, carries the weight of a much longer speech. He said, "For the record, Operator 2 performed the critical engagement. Her shot was clean, correct, and decisive. She is the reason this operation achieved its objective. Full stop." Lieutenant D later told me that she had written down those words, exactly as spoken, and kept them. I understand why. End of Part 1. Part 2. Document 2. Everything that comes after the shot. The problem with a moment that changes everything is that the everything it changes isn't finished changing for a very long time. I'm going to pick up the story on the same day, roughly 4 hours after the shot, because the shot is not the whole story, not even close. The shot is the axis that everything else rotates around, but the rotation, that took months. That took a full year before it settled into something stable, and even then, stable is a complicated word for what she had to navigate. I didn't know any of that at 8:30 a.m. on the morning I've been describing. What I knew at 8:30 a.m. was that I had witnessed something. My camera had footage. My notebook had 2 words. My brain was doing the thing it does after a significant event, playing it back on a loop at slightly different speeds, trying to sequence it, trying to find the edges of it. I sat on a low concrete barrier about 60 meters from my original press position, and I drank the rest of my terrible petrol station coffee, and I tried to decide what I was going to do next. The answer, obviously, was find out what I could. The secondary answer was, accept that what I could find out today was going to be a fraction of what had actually happened, and that the fuller picture was going to take weeks or months to assemble. Both of those answers were correct. The first person who tried to explain Mara Voss to me was someone I'll call the contact. The contact reached out to me approximately 3 weeks after the morning I've described. He reached out through a method I won't detail. He said he had information about the operator involved in the engagement and asked if I was interested. I said I was interested. He said he would talk to me once briefly, and that I would not be able to record the conversation or attribute anything specifically to him. I agreed. We met in a place I'll describe only as indoors and comfortable, which it was, which made the conversation feel strange because the things he was saying were not particularly comfortable. Here's what you need to understand first, he said. She's not the first, and what happened to her after won't be the last of this. I asked him to explain. He said, the operation worked. That's documented. That's on record. Commander P put it on record in the clearest possible terms. And none of that changes the fact that the moment the after-action process began, the formal review, the documentation, the institutional response, people started looking for reasons. I asked reasons for what? Reasons why it didn't have to be her. Reasons why the result could have been achieved another way. There's a particular kind of institutional thinking. He paused, chose his words carefully, that can absorb a success but then quietly work to prevent that success from becoming a precedent, from becoming the thing that establishes that she belongs in that role. I sat with that for a moment. Is that what happened? He looked at me. I'm telling you what the institutional environment looked like in the weeks after. What happens next is still being written. But the pressure to categorize what she did as exceptional, as a one-time anomaly rather than a demonstration of qualification, that pressure started the same day. I need to tell you about the after-action review. Not because I was present for it, I wasn't, but because it forms the next chapter of what happened to her, and because the details of it have been described to me by multiple people who were involved in it, and because you can't understand the full shape of this story without understanding how institutions process things that don't fit their existing templates. The formal review began 48 hours after the operation. Standard procedure. Expected. The operational timeline was documented. The decision points were logged. The communications record, every transmission on the command frequency, the full timestamp archive, was assembled and reviewed. Commander P submitted his after-action report. It was unambiguous. It documented the coverage gap, the decision to activate Position 7, the tactical coordinator's objection, and his own decision to override it, the engagement, and the outcome. He assigned full operational credit to Operator 2, Mara Voss, for what he described as a precision engagement under significant time pressure that achieved the operational objective with no collateral effect. The report was clear, the record was clear. And then the review process went up a level. At the level above Commander P, the report encountered what I've been told was a more complicated reception. This is the language of someone trying to be diplomatic about something that wasn't diplomatic. What it means, in the translation I've assembled from multiple sources, is that there were senior personnel involved in the review process who had strong feelings about the question of whether Mara Voss's engagement represented an appropriate use of a female operator in a primary sniper role. The operational record said it was appropriate. Commander P's report said it was appropriate. The outcome, clear, documented, unambiguous in its success, said it was appropriate. None of that resolved the feelings. What happened instead was a slow, institutional conversation. Not confrontational, not documented in ways that made anyone look directly bad. The slow, atmospheric kind of institutional conversation that happens when an organization needs to process something it doesn't know how to categorize. The tactical coordinator filed a supplemental objection. Not to the outcome, he couldn't object to the outcome, but to the process. He filed a formal note stating that the decision to activate Position 7 without going through secondary confirmation represented a deviation from established protocol that should be flagged for future guidance. Commander P responded in writing that the deviation was justified by the time constraint and the intelligence picture, that he stood by his decision fully, and that the outcome validated his assessment. The supplemental objection and the response were both filed. They both went into the record, and then the record was reviewed by a committee that I know existed but whose membership and deliberations I cannot detail. The committee's finding, as described to me by someone with access to it, the operation was assessed as successful. The engagement was assessed as appropriate given the operational circumstances. Commander P's command decisions were assessed as within his authority. Mara Voss received a performance commendation, and she was not assigned to a forward deployment sniper position for the next 11 months. She didn't make noise about it. I want to tell you this clearly because the temptation when telling a story like this is to construct a narrative arc that requires the central figure to be openly, publicly fighting the system, to be vocal, confrontational, making speeches. She wasn't. She went back to her unit. She maintained her performance ratings, which were, according to people who reviewed them, exceptional across every metric. She participated in her standard training rotations. She was professional, present, and composed in her professional environment in exactly the way she had always been. She did not, to the knowledge of anyone I've spoken to, complain about the assignment pattern. She did not file grievances. She did not speak to journalists, including me, not then. She did not make the case publicly that she was being managed in a way that the operational record didn't support. She did one thing. She got better. She trained with the specific dedication of someone who has decided that the only argument worth making is the one that exists in measurable performance. She extended her already exceptional marksmanship. She added qualifications in close-quarters environments, extended-range environments, moving target scenarios. She pursued advanced courses in tactical meteorology, the study of how wind and atmospheric conditions affect ballistics, in a way that placed her in a category of technical knowledge that very few operators at any level had achieved. She trained as if the thing she needed to prove was provable through accumulation of demonstrated skill, and as if she intended to accumulate enough of it that the argument would eventually collapse under its own weight. I think she was right about that. I also think it cost her more than it should have. There's a woman I'll call Captain R. She was senior to Mara in the command structure, and she's one of the people I've been able to speak to directly, on a limited basis, about what this period looked like from the inside. The thing that was hard to watch, she told me, was that she never showed it, the frustration, the specific grief of being assessed as exceptional in one context and then quietly sidelined in the next. You'd look at her performance records and you'd look at her assignment pattern and they didn't match up. And she knew they didn't match up. She's not someone who doesn't notice things. I asked if she thought Mara was hiding it. Captain R thought about this. I think she'd made a decision about where to put her energy, and she decided that putting it into the frustration was expensive in a way she couldn't afford. I asked expensive how? Expensive in focus. If you're running at full performance, and she always was, you can't also be running at full emotional investment in the injustice of it. You have to choose, and she chose performance. She paused, then she said something that I've thought about many times since. The hard part is that making that choice, that discipline, requires a kind of self-containment that most people will never have to develop. And then those same people will look at someone who's developed it out of necessity and call it coldness. Call it lack of passion, which is insane, actually. It's the opposite. It's the most disciplined form of passion there is. Lieutenant D, the intelligence officer who had been in the command unit on the morning of the operation, reached out to me approximately 4 months after my conversation with the contact. She reached out through a mutual colleague. She said she'd been told I was constructing a thorough account of the events in question, and she wanted to make sure certain things were in the record. We met. She was direct. She had the quality of precision that operational intelligence work develops in people, an instinct for identifying the most economical path to a true statement. "I want to correct one thing that's probably in whatever version of this you've assembled," she said, before I told her what version I had. "Which thing?" "The commander's hesitation," she said, before he authorized her. "People are describing it as hesitation born from doubt about her. That's not accurate." I asked what was accurate. "He hesitated because he was calculating risk," which is what he's supposed to do. The calculus included the coverage gap, the threat timeline, the secondary options or absence of secondary options, and her profile. Her profile said she was the best person for the engagement. His hesitation was about making sure he checked every variable, not about doubting her. She paused. "I want that in the record because the version where he doubted her and then she proved him wrong, that's a satisfying story. But it's not the whole truth. The truth is more complicated. The truth is that he believed she could do it. The resistance was coming from someone else, and he chose to override that resistance, which is its own form of moral courage, and it should be named as that." I wrote that down carefully. Then I asked her, what was it like in the command unit in the moment after the shot? She was quiet for a few seconds. "There was relief," she said. "Obviously, there was the professional relief of an operation reaching a successful resolution. But there was something else too, something harder to name." She paused again. It was like something had been proven, but nobody was quite ready to say what it was that had been proven or what that meant for the next question. It was this very strange combination of clarity and unresolvedness, if that makes sense. It made sense. "The shot was clear," she said. "What came after it that was less clear for a long time? I want to tell you about the 11 months. Not in exhaustive detail, but enough that you understand what they were. Because the 11 months, the period between the operation and the point at which the institutional conversation finally resolved into something different, that period is the part of this story that I think matters most in terms of what it says about the world Mara Voss was operating in. She went to every training evolution that was offered. She performed at the top of every one. Her fitness reports, the formal evaluations that the Navy generates at regular intervals for every operator, were uniformly exceptional. Commander P wrote one of them. In the comments section, he wrote, "Operator Voss represents the highest standard of professional and operational performance I have encountered in my command tenure. My recommendation is unequivocal. Full forward deployment authorization should be extended without qualification." It was unequivocal. It was also not immediately acted upon. The thing that finally changed, and I've deliberated about how much of this to tell you, because some of it touches people who are still in active service. The thing that changed was a combination of two factors arriving at the same time. The first factor was external. A senior institutional figure whose name I won't include became involved in a review of deployment eligibility criteria for female operators across multiple service contexts. This figure's involvement created a moment of broader institutional attention on the question, not specifically on Mara, but on the category she represented. It forced the conversation out of the informal, atmospheric space it had been occupying and into a formal context where it had to produce accountable answers. The second factor was Mara herself, not an action she took, a result she achieved. In a training evaluation, an exercise technically, not a live operation, she performed an engagement at a distance and under conditions that the evaluating team described in their report as well beyond standard qualification parameters. The range, the conditions, the specific scenario complexity, she cleared it in a way that landed on the evaluating team's summary as a record. Not a category record, not a training class record. A program record. The best performance in that specific evaluation type that had been recorded. The evaluating team's recommendation was submitted the following week. Commander P got the copy that mattered to him. He called Lieutenant D to read her the relevant line. She said later that she had to sit down after the call. The formal authorization came on a Tuesday in June. I don't know which Tuesday exactly. I have a range of dates but not a confirmed specific date, and I'm not going to print a date I'm not certain of. What I know is that it was a Tuesday, because 3 separate people who are aware of when it happened have mentioned Tuesday specifically, and I assume they're not all fabricating the same detail. Mara Voss was informed by Commander P directly. He told me later, we've spoken twice, very briefly on deep background, that he'd made the call himself rather than letting it go through standard notification channels, because he felt that, given everything, she deserved to hear it from a voice she knew. I asked him what she said when he told her. He was quiet for a moment. She said, "Thank you, sir," and then she said, "What's my first rotation?" He laughed when he told me that. A short, specific kind of laugh, the kind that carries relief and admiration and a trace of something melancholy all at once. "That's her," he said. "That is completely her." I asked Captain R, at the end of our final conversation, what she thought Mara's story meant. It's the kind of question that a journalist asks because they're hoping for a clean sentence that they can end a piece with. And it's almost always an unfair question because the real answer is almost never clean. Captain R didn't give me a clean answer. She said, "I think it means that the proving never stops. Not really. You can prove it. You can prove it clearly, undeniably on the record. And then the next context arrives and the proving starts again from a position that isn't as far ahead as it should be given what you already proved. And you have to decide every single time whether you're going to do the proving or whether you're going to do something else with that energy." She paused. And what Mara decided, consistently, every time was to do the proving. Which is extraordinary, and also shouldn't have been necessary. Both of those things are true at the same time. I asked, does she know that? Does she know her story means something beyond her own career? Captain R considered this seriously. "I think she thinks about the next person," she said finally. "I think she understands that what she does and how she does it, and whether she maintains her standard under the specific pressures she's under, I think she understands that it changes the geometry slightly for the person who comes after her, makes the ceiling slightly higher, moves the starting line slightly forward." She looked at her hands for a moment. She doesn't talk about it that way. She probably wouldn't. But the thing she's doing, this sustained, relentless, meticulous demonstration, it's not just for herself. I think she knows that. I think that's part of what keeps her doing it the way she does it. I met Mara Voss once. Just once. It was the summer of 2019, just over a year after the morning I've been describing. I was introduced to her at an event. I won't say what kind of event, by a mutual acquaintance who knew I'd been working on what I vaguely described as a long-form project related to operational matters. She shook my hand. She was taller than I expected, though I don't know why I'd formed an expectation about her height. There was a quality in her handshake that wasn't aggressive but wasn't soft either. A neutral, level, absolute quality, like a surface that's been checked for plumb. We talked for approximately 8 minutes. She didn't know I was the journalist who'd been writing about the events she'd been involved in. Or if she knew, she gave no indication. We talked about things I won't reproduce here because they were personal, conversational, completely off any professional topic. What I'll tell you is what I observed. She was present. That's the word I keep coming back to. Fully, unusually present. When she was listening to you, she was actually listening, not waiting for her turn to speak, not processing something else in the background of her attention. And when she spoke, she said what she meant, not dressed up, not performing, just said it. There was something in her eyes that I've thought about many times since. Not distance, the opposite of distance. A very close, very clear attention to what was directly in front of her, like someone who has developed, through long practice, the ability to be completely in the present moment. Not because the past and future don't exist, but because the present is where the work is. 8 minutes. I didn't get a quote. I didn't ask for one. That wasn't the right thing to do in that setting, and I knew it. What I got was an impression. And the impression I got was of someone who had decided, at some point, that the most powerful argument she could make was not the argument she made with her mouth, but the argument she made with her actions, and that she had committed to that argument with a totality that left very little room for anything else. Whether that was the right choice, whether the cost of it was worth the result, that's not mine to say, that's hers. But I'll say this, whatever the cost was, she paid it. Every day in small, unremarkable increments she paid it. And the result, the operational record, the performance history, the authorization that came on a Tuesday in June, the program record that still stands, the result is what it is. She built it. There's something I haven't told you, yet that I want to tell you now, at the end. On the morning of the operation, before the shot, before the command net transmission, before any of what I've described, there was a moment at approximately 8:19 a.m. when I turned my long lens toward the rooftop to my left. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was doing what journalists do at locations where something might happen. I was scanning, looking at everything without looking at anything in particular, letting the frame tell me if there was a story in it. The rooftop was textured with loose stones and ventilation hardware. There were shadows from a raised structure at the east end. The early morning light was coming from the wrong angle for good photography, but I had the lens there anyway. And for a moment, for just a moment, I saw something. Or I think I saw something. I've gone back and looked at the footage, and what I saw is right at the edge of what the camera resolves. An outline, a shape that doesn't belong to the architecture. A person lying very still. I moved the lens. I moved it because I was scanning, because that's what you do. I didn't focus on the shape. I didn't hold the frame on it. I've thought about that moment many times. I've thought about all the ways that the shot, that single, clean, decisive shot, almost didn't happen. The coverage gap that was supposed to be filled by a primary sniper team that didn't have the angle. The tactical coordinator's objection that came within an argument of being acted upon. The 11 months afterward that almost succeeded in categorizing what she did as an exception rather than a qualification. All of those near misses. All of those moments where the thing that happened almost didn't. And at the center of all of it, lying still on a cold rooftop since 4 in the morning, holding her breath in a controlled pattern, running her calculations, maintaining her sight picture, waiting for the mark, was a person who had decided years earlier that proving the case was the work. That showing up at the standard was the argument. That there was no cleaner answer to a question about whether you belong somewhere than being the person who saves the thing that needed saving. She was the reason it worked. Not despite everything. Because of everything, because of what she'd built, what she'd endured, what she'd refused to let diminish her, and what she could do with a rifle on a rooftop in a cold northeast wind with 3 hours of stillness behind her, and the only gap in the geometry directly in her sight picture. She was always going to be the reason it worked. It just took the rest of the world a little while to catch up. She was 29 years old on the morning of the operation. She grew up in a flat place under a big sky in Minnesota, and her mother was a competitive archer, and she could outshoot her older brother at 14, and she speaks 4 languages, and she lay on a graveled rooftop for 3 hours in near-freezing wind and held her position for 47 minutes after the shot, waiting for the all-clear. And then she stood up, checked her weapon, asked about the transit window, and went back to work.